As American imperialism turns from one theater of intervention to the next, with Cuba once again restored to its traditional place in the ideological arsenal, preparing for the coming confrontations of world capitalism, the bourgeois simultaneously revives the familiar specter of communism within its own domestic politics. The recent strengthening of the social democratic current within the Democratic Party merely furnishes the opposing bourgeois faction with the occasion to resurrect the anti-communist mythology through which the American state has for generations disciplined the proletarian and enlarged its repressive machinery. Both parties profit from this spectacle. One inflates the menace, the other invokes the violated conscience of democracy. Each strengthens the state, while the false opposition in the streets pleads only for the restoration of a more humane administration of the bourgeois order. Against this entire comedy, the communist position remains one of complete indifference. The proletariat has no democratic rights to recover, only the dictatorship of capital to smash through the reconstitution of its independent class movement. The bourgeois proclaimed the end of history after the dissolution of the USSR. For us, that was never a turning point, merely another episode in the development of world capitalism. The Russian counter-revolution had long since consummated its own developmentalist regime of state capitalism beneath socialist phraseology. The collapse of its state form changed nothing fundamental in the global domination of capitalist relations. Bereft of its traditional adversary, American imperialism found another in international terrorism and organized around it 2 decades of military intervention, patriotic mobilizations, and domestic repression. Today, as the contradictions of accumulation sharpen and inter-imperialist antagonisms again dominate the world horizon, the old anti-communist vocabulary is restored to service. But notice who it's actually pointed at. The specters invoked now are not revolutionary communism. They are the harmless shadows of bourgeois radicalism, social democracy, anti-fascism, all denounced as communist precisely because genuine communism has been absent from the historical stage for decades. It is easier for the bourgeois to prosecute one faction of capital under the name of communism than to confront the actual spectral reappearance of an independent proletarian movement lurking on the historical horizon once more. These liberal and social democratic currents are the indispensable street appendages of the democratic wing of capital. Their endless appeals to activism, to electoral mobilization, community organizing, reproduce the oldest illusions in bourgeois politics, that the contradiction of capitalism can be resolved through a more democratic administration of the same order. Their function is to dissolve the proletariat into the shapeless category of the people, subordinating class antagonisms to the perpetual regeneration of the democratic state. And as accumulation sharpens and the world prepares for a new cycle of inter-imperialist conflict, this democratic mobilization becomes the necessary complement to an expanding repressive apparatus. The bourgeoisie is preparing simultaneously for external war and for the inevitable return of internal class conflict. And in the temporary absence of an independent proletarian movement, it manufactures substitute enemies, moral panics, fictitious threats, rehearsing in advance the ideological forms through which tomorrow's class struggle will again be mystified and attacked. Now, this state has never simply waited for its enemies to appear, it manufactures them. During the War on Terror, hundreds of FBI informants and undercover agents penetrated mosques, community organizations, online forums, not merely to uncover conspiracies, but to provoke them into existence. In one widely reported case, an informant walked into a California mosque offering access to Tomahawk missiles, fishing for anyone willing to bite. In Portland, federal agents spent months cultivating a 19-year-old Muhammad Osama Muhammad before handing him what he believed was a live explosive device for blowing up the city's Christmas tree lighting. arresting him only after the state itself had supplied every essential element of the plot. Scores of stings followed this same pattern, isolated vulnerable targets, plans suggested by informants, weapons supplied by the authorities, spectacular arrests presented afterwards as proof of an ever-present menace. These were not abuses at the margins. They were ordinary mechanisms by which the capitalist state enlarged its police powers while manufacturing consent for their expansion. To think such methods vanished because the designated enemy changed would be to mistake a permanent function of the bourgeois state for a passing episode. The same operation is reappearing now under a new banner. The Bourgeois Center for Strategic Internal Studies report 35 quote-unquote left-wing extremism attacks and 13 fatalities between 2016 and 2025. With 2025, they say, the first-year left-wing attacks exceeded right-wing ones. But read their own numbers: 152 right-wing attacks, 112 deaths over the same period, with jihadists and ethno-nationalist violence carved out into separate categories to narrow the comparison. The figures themselves are secondary. Their purpose isn't scientific, it's ideological preparation. Just as terrorism once swallowed every social contradiction whole, today an eclectic assortment of anti-fascist social democrats, anarchists, environmentalists, and imaginary communist conspiracies is being assembled into a new internal enemy against which the coercive apparatus of the state can once again be enlarged. Genuine communism, absent from the stage for decades, is invoked only as an empty name, a name beneath which the bourgeois prosecutes conflict internal to its own order, while forging the instruments that will tomorrow be turned against the real reemergence of the proletarian movement. Consider how quickly the pretexts have arrived. The killing of Charlie Kirk, still full of unanswered questions, the alleged attempt on Trump, the transformations of Luigi Maggioni into the latest commodity of individualist political spectacle, all of it feeding a renewed offensive against the chimera of far-left terrorism. On July 16th, the State Department convened a conference of over 60 countries to combat left-wing terrorism. This despite political violence from the left being demonstrably smaller than violence from the right, let alone from any actual proletarian or communist current. The conference opened by invoking the long-extinct Red Brigades, Baader-Meinhof, the Weather Underground, and the Shining Path, names meant to summon in the minds of the world bourgeoisie the old terror of Stalinist communism, a conspiracy against Western civilization itself. It serves the larger project well, preparing for war against a false communist rival imperialism abroad, for keeping the domestic working class from ever affiliating with a real communist party here at home. The American state has now designated 4 European anarchists and anti-fascist groups as global terrorist organizations: Antifa, Ost in Germany, the Informal Anarchist Federation in Italy, Armed Proletarian Justice and Revolutionary Self-Defense in Greece, with rewards of up to $10 million offered for information to disrupt their finances. At home, this coincides with Antifa being designated a domestic terrorist group, and with the prior signing of NSPM 7, creating a federal task force against domestic terrorism defined in the state's own words by quote-unquote anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, by support, in short, for the overthrow of the U.S. government. And where yesterday the target was street anarchists and anti-fascists, today it is the electoral war with the Social Democrats, red baiting laid down as the battle line ahead of a possible move on Cuba. All of it in preparation for confrontation with China. Listen to the Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick on camera echoing the godless communism mania of the Red Scare after World War II. Quote, "We know what communists do around the world. They remove God. They close the churches. They punish the believers." A State Department paper on Cuban quote-unquote communism names the DSA, Black Lives Matter, the Amalgamated Labor Union, and Code Pink as exports of Cuba's supposed communist revolution, subverting American capitalism from within. The Cuban Institute of Friendship with the Peoples has been sanctioned. 3 Cuban nationals connected to it sit in federal custody, awaiting deportation on charges of ties to the transnational communist subversion network. All of this alongside hundreds of millions in new spending to combat Chinese influence in the Caribbean and Central America, chiefly underseas cables and port ownership along the Panama Canal, and a State Department plan reported by the Associated Press to spend upward of $500 million disrupting Chinese influence worldwide. The Red Scare has a history, and it did not begin abroad. American anti-communism is not a Cold War invention. It is the first and foremost the domestic policy of American capital towards its own working class, a policy that predates by decades any foreign state it would later be pointed at. It became an instrument of international strategy only the moment the Russian Revolution gave it a state to strike at. American troops landed in Russia on Russian soil to attempt to directly combat the Red Army following the Russian Revolution, but it failed. American capital funded the white counter-revolution. The same logic later governed the whole decolonized world, where Washington fought to bring every newly independent state into its financial orbit, forestalling proletarian revolution wherever it threatened, even collaborating with global Stalinism where useful, as both carved the planet into rival imperialist blocs. This anti-communist rhetoric, imported from the first Red Scare, was later turned on Cuba, Vietnam, Venezuela. It does not mean, though, that these states ever embodied the workers' power it claimed to fear, only that each is a national capital administrating its own proletariat, and Washington wants a greater share of what is extracted from the proletariat. It is the same discipline applied at home. Long before Lenin, before any Cuban had heard the name Marx, the American bourgeois had already built the physical apparatus of class war on its own soil. After the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 swept across a dozen states and had to be crushed by federal troops and state militia, cities across the country raised fortress-like armories in their own downtowns, built to house National Guard units for the suppression of labor. The railroad strike and the Paris Commune, both erupting in the same decade, already prefigured the panic the bourgeois would later attach to the name of Bolshevism. But those armories were not raised against a ghost. They were infrastructure built in direct response to a real uprising of American workers. And the ideology of anti-communism was fitted onto that infrastructure only afterwards. The pattern repeats. The Espionage and Sedition Acts and the Palmer Raids after the First Imperialist War, crushing the industrial workers of the world for refusing nationalist intoxication, and again in 1947, when the largest strike wave in the country's history was answered with Taft-Hartley, compelling every union officer to disavow communism. In every case, the repressive apparatus came before the threat it claimed to be answering. The fear behind these episodes was never feigned. The American press erupted in panic about communists a full 50 years before the Bolsheviks existed to blame for anything. But this class fear, it fears something closer to home too. The historical instability of its own position within production. Marx showed in the 27th chapter of the third volume of Capital that the joint stock company already accomplishes within capital itself the abolition of capital as private property, turning the owner into a mere claimant on interest, a self-dissolving contradiction, hollowing the bourgeois out from within. And in this way, American capitalism is no more communist than Cuban. Yet both are setting the economic framework for the future arrival of a real communist revolution. Layer that old fear onto today's crisis of overproduction, and you get a chronic readiness to see danger everywhere. In a mayor's rent control bill, as much as in the picket line, and a DSA canvasser as much as in Antifa. Rehearsals, all of it, for the sacrifices soon to be demanded in a larger confrontation already being prepared against China. Now let's turn to Cuba itself, because our position here has never been the vulgar textbook one. It has always been the mark of vulgar Marxism to measure the class nature of a regime by the registry of deeds. Who owns the factory? Answer, the state. And it declares victory, socialism. We have never reasoned that way. Marx found his critique on capital as a social relation, the subordination of living labor to accumulation, the persistence of wage dependence, regardless of who signs the paycheck, and include the development of profit-driven capitalist firms and the commodity exchange under the market economy. Capitalism has established in Cuba for decades before the 26th of July movement ever took power. Cuba's anti-colonial movement, born against U.S. domination, imposed since 1898, was never a struggle against feudal structures, the kind that shook Asia and Africa in the same period. From the outset, it was a struggle within the bourgeois horizon, not to overturn Cuban capitalism, but to redistribute the surplus value extracted from Cuban labor into the pockets of the Cuban bourgeoisie, itself a product of decades of capitalist accumulation, raised generation after generation in subjection to U.S. capital, had by the 1950s accumulated enough weight of its own in sugar and land in a native professional class to seek separation from its more powerful neighbors. This was a bourgeois chafing at subordination, not a proletarian seeking to abolish class rule. And every stage of the movement bears that origin. Leadership stayed firmly in the bourgeois hands throughout, even though it was the Cuban proletariat that fought most courageously against Batista. The working class could not contest that leadership for two reasons. There was no communist party to point it towards its historical tasks, and the working class of the capitalist metropoles, paralyzed by Stalinism and reformism, offered colonial peoples no support at all. The proletarian was nevertheless central to 1959. Our current recorded at Rome meeting in March 1961 that of some 2 million workers, 1.5 million were wage earners, 800,000 of them agricultural, 500,000 dependent on sugar alone, working only 4 months a year with seasonal unemployment reaching 15 to 20%. It was this mass of desperately poor, permanently unstable agricultural labor that filled Castro's guerrilla ranks. But the revolution always drew on urban struggles, sabotage strikes, the proletarian's weapon par excellence, largely erased from the later Castro-Guevara telling. Absent a revolutionary leadership to contest it, the bourgeois harnessed all of that working class commitment for its own project of national affirmation. Sugar was the spine of the whole economy, over 3/4 of exports by 1957. Most cultivated land and 2/3 of refining capacity in American hands. Cuba imported nearly everything from U.S., exporting raw sugar only to buy back finished goods, running a $500 million deficit through the whole of Batista's second dictatorship. Relative prosperity in the cities and a literacy rate among the highest in Latin America sat right alongside the extreme poverty of the sugar workers in an economy of gambling and prostitution built to service American tourism. It was against this domination, more than against Batista the man, that sections of the middle and lower bourgeois, having exhausted hope for peaceful change, turned to violence. The Moncada assault of July 26, 1953, marked the rupture, though even this did not yet put Castro's movement in open conflict with Washington. Sectors of the U.S. administration initially welcomed opposition to the unstable Batista. The absence of any proletarian content in this struggle is confirmed by the Moncada program itself. Restoration of the 1940 Constitution, compensated land redistribution, a 30% profit share for workers, 55% of sugarcane revenue for growers, confiscation of embezzled state assets. Castro himself insisted at his trial that none of it exceeded the existing constitution, summarizing his whole program as 6 problems: land, industrialization, housing, unemployment, education, health, plus political democracy. Not one of these touches the wage relation. Every one of them is ordinary bourgeois reform, the ground any liberal constitutionalists of the day could have signed on to without embarrassment. It was on that ground, not any socialist ground, that the movement built its legitimacy, years before Washington's hostility ever pushed it towards Moscow. The program did not change on the road to Havana. The new regime's first measures nationalized 90% of industry and 70% of the land, striking overwhelmingly at U.S. holdings above 405 hectares. This, not any prior class antagonism, produced the rupture with Washington and the blockade that stunted Cuban accumulation for the next half century. It was enmity between two national capitals, not a conflict between classes, that pushed Havana towards Moscow and dressed the whole thing up in a socialist facade that changed nothing beneath. Cuba's place in the world division of labor stayed exactly what it had been. The Soviets bought sugar above market price for oil, and by 1978, sugar was 87% of exports. Diversification falling under Soviet imposition just as thoroughly as it had failed under the Americans. Cuba today is 11 million people still dependent on the world market it cannot set terms with. The state became the collective administrator of Cuban capital. Soviet subsidy changed the address of the dependence, not its substance. The Soviet collapse produced the special period. GDP fell 36% between 1990 and 93. Meat and fish consumption collapsed. Out of that crisis came legal farmers markets. We all know about farmers markets here in Portland. Dollarization, foreign investment, self-employment across some 150 trades. The private sector workforce rising from 8% in 1981 to 23% by 2000, alongside a black market that has never stopped growing. Strikes stayed banned the whole time. Guevara ruled them illegal as early as 1961. And in 2008, the regime raised the retirement age. One anti-proletarian measure indistinguishable from what any bourgeois government elsewhere was doing at the same moment. The transfer of power between the Castro brothers changed nothing either. It reflected only the impossibility of distributing a state machine's entrenched network of interest, now drifting towards a Vietnamese model of market liberation under one-party rule. Havana's 2000 arrangement with Chavez, doctors and services traded for subsidized oil, became, through ALBA, the principal external support of Cuban accumulation. But by 2024, Venezuela's shipments had fallen from 56,000 barrels a day to roughly 32, as Venezuela's own production collapsed, exposing once again the underlying weakness and leaving Havana searching for a new patron. And the search has led to China. The 1959 Agrarian Reform Law aimed to break up the great estates and plantations and build a genuine domestic agricultural economy. Instead, as Cuba integrated into Soviet imperialism, it consolidated agriculture under state firm management. The private plantation owner disappeared, but the plantation economy did not. Soviet subsidies kept sugar at 80% of exports through the 1980s, and by 1990, genuinely independent farmers controlled only about 9% of the land. The Soviet collapse forced the question back on the agenda. Animal traction, organic fertilizer, smaller scale farming, oxen teams rising from under 100,000 to roughly 300,000. Anybody who's familiar with Marx's Capital section on primitive accumulation and the development of the agrarian revolution in England will see a very similar story here. Venezuela oil postponed the reckoning further. Its decline intensified the pressure again. Usufruct reforms transferred state land to farmers and cooperatives, and by 2017, the non-state sector was cultivating some 83% of agricultural land, even as the state still formally owned about 79%. The new reforms of June 2026 push this further still. Long-term land use rights for private, state, mixed, and individual entities, wage labor permitted on usufruct land, cooperatives free to trade and borrow abroad directly, prices negotiated without state mediation, input markets open to private and foreign firms. What's emerging is a fuller circuit of commodity production. Farmers, private distributors, reinvestment, non-state retail raising from 44 to 55% of sales in the single year. Washington, for its part, is opening its financial services and markets to independent Cuban businesses, steering fuel away from state enterprises, turning what began as a survival mechanisms into the seed of an autonomous agricultural bourgeoisie. This connects directly to industrialization. Cuba's problem was never simply a shortage of oil. It was a model whose reproduction always depended on outside inputs. First international markets, then Soviet petroleum, then Venezuelan oil, without ever building an internal chain needed for independent capitalist development. Chinese financed solar and irrigation projects now aim to cut that dependence on oil and swap it for dependence on Chinese technology and finance. The modernization of the Antillana de Acero steel complex, a new electric arc furnace, a rolling mill of some 226,000 tons of finished steel is a project that they have in the works right now, and it requires reliable power, transport credit, and imports at a scale that neither the USSR nor Venezuela was any longer able to support, but China can. Havana is opening to larger private and foreign capital, even as Washington courts and the private sector away from the military-run GAESA in Cuba. Cuba's industrialization is becoming a contest over which foreign capital will supply the finance capital for Cuba's development, Chinese imperialism or American imperialism. Yet it would be a mistake to think that the Castro-linked GAESA stands at odds with the agricultural bourgeois it is now so deliberately cultivating. This was a section of the class it recognized as necessary from the very beginning of the Cuban Revolution. Only now, after a painful sequence of crises, has the Cuban capitalist class been forced to actually develop it. It would likewise be a mistake to read the growing private market as necessarily opposed to the state capitalist structure in existence. The reforms announced over recent months are not the forced retreat of some supposed socialism that never existed in the first place. They are an advance of the Cuban agrarian revolution, the next stage in the bourgeois revolution, state capitalist developmental regime in Cuba. A word on the GAESA, the international counterpart to all of this. The Cuban military political bourgeois, organized through the revolutionary armed forces, built, as revolutionary states always do, a new armed state machine from the outset, designed to secure and reproduce its own power. Soviet armed and Soviet trained, it evolved into an expeditionary force integrated into Soviet strategy. Some 300,000 Cuban troops were deployed abroad over the course of the Cold War in military conflicts. Tens of thousands in Angola, over 15,000 in Ethiopia. That military organization became a permanent apparatus for defending Cuban capital from subordination to Yankee capital, for projecting power abroad, and eventually for administrating accumulation itself domestically. Out of the 1990s crisis came GAESA, the mechanism through which the armed forces generate and control foreign exchange through tourism, retail, logistics, finance, ports, foreign trade control. They control those industries. It is not a conventional state enterprise. It is a political command military organization and economic management fused into a single conglomerate with Castro leadership embedded directly in it. General Luis Alberto Rodriguez Lopez Calleja, Raul Castro's former son-in-law, head of the GAESA until his death in 2022, was the living embodiment of that fusion. Seen this way, the Cuban military economic apparatus is not necessarily an obstacle to further capitalist development. It functions as it is always in order to preserve the Cuban state, to accumulate capital on the backs of the Cuban proletarian without surrendering control to American finance. The opening of private agriculture, private firms, and foreign investments isn't a retreat from some socialist system. It's the evolution of a developmentalist capitalist state in its more developed form. Lenin identified imperialism by the concentration of capital into monopolies, the fusion of bank and industrial capital into finance capital, the growing export of capital, international monopolist combinations, and the division of the world amongst the great powers. The point is not merely that China or the U.S. lends Cuba money. It's that the accumulated capital seeks profitable outlets beyond its borders, and in doing so carries with it the machinery, the technology, the contracts through which that capital reproduces itself. Lenin stressed that the borrowing country receives less than the loan's nominal value, while the lending country's banks and firms secure the commissions, the contracts, the control over development. A loan finances a railway, a power plant, a port, and the firms of the creditor country supply the equipment and pockets the contracts. Cuba's growing dependence on Chinese finance fits the pattern precisely. Just as Mexico's manufacturing integration into North America reflects another configuration on the same world economy. This rivalry is not capitalism against socialism. It is a rivalry among capitals organized through different states over markets, infrastructure, and spheres of influence. Havana can bargain for better terms, diversify its creditors, use Chinese capital to industrialize. None of that abolishes the relationship of capitalism. It only changes which national configuration the relation runs through. For the Cuban working class, the essential question never changes. Whether the factory of the power plant is financed by Washington, Beijing, Moscow, or Havana, the abolition of exploitation cannot be identified with swapping one national capital for another. Imperialism is the struggle among those capitals. Our task is to abolish the social relations that make the struggle possible in the first place. Now, as the imperialist blocs collide and the competition for markets and the crisis of overproduction intensifies, capital must prepare for war. As we have seen, the Cold War era's imperialist confrontations were accompanied by two Red Scares, just as the global war on terror was accompanied by its own domestic repression. Likewise, the world wars each required an accompanying reformist economy at home to contain the working class. We are watching all of this be built again right now, which is why we will close on this false socialists, because this is where the threat becomes most useful to capital. The ruling bourgeois faction brands the Democratic Socialists of America communists and radicals, even as the president weeks earlier met with New York's newly elected DSA mayor Zohran Mamdani, called him a very rational person, predicted he'd make the city great again, and said he expected to be helping him, not hurting him. Mamdani is no threat to capital. He is its agent, securing social peace through democratic reformist illusions. The bourgeois right paints the bourgeois left as the great red menace, reviving Cold War hysteria against a rival that no longer exists, precisely when it needs a domestic enemy to justify the apparatus it's building for a foreign one. The left, meanwhile, gets to present itself to its own base as the defender of democracy against fascism and oligarchy. The two need each other, and they help each other. This theater plays easily because the democratic base has narrowed to exactly that layer our current has always identified as the classic recruiting ground for the petty bourgeois radicalism. Less the labor aristocracy of an earlier period, more the intelligentsia and a middle class being steadily ground down by capital itself. Accumulation dissolves this stratum as surely as it dispossesses the worker, but it does not become useless to capital. Precisely because its own ground is dissolving, this middle class remains, as history shows again and again, the most effective material the bourgeois has for mobilizing discontent behind a restoration program that never once touches the wage relation. Nothing in the mayor's actual program changed between the meeting and the denunciation. What changed was the electoral calendar and capital's calculation of how much anxious rhetoric was useful ahead of the midterms to bash over the head of the proletarian as it moves forward with its constant imperialist scheming. A social democratic administration promising rent control, public grocery stores, free bus disturbs no fundamental interests of capital because it redistributes the fruit of wage labor exploitation here and there, or profit accumulation more generously without, for one moment, touching the capitalist relations at all. Labor is still bought and sold as a commodity. The enterprise, public or private, still has to cover its costs and reproduce itself through sale. The firm asks only one question of whoever holds office: will the wage relation continue? Will production still be organized for sale, not use? The social democrat answers yes. as readily as the free market conservative, differing only on how to distribute what's extracted. But something deeper is at work beneath both the cordiality and the denunciation. A capitalism preparing for protracted rivalry with another bloc doesn't merely tolerate a competent administrator of urban discontents, it needs one. Affordable rent, subsidized transit, a mayor who can tell a restless population their government hears them. This is exactly the purpose served by the rising trend of municipal socialism and socialists elected to city governments across the country. These are a form of social insurance capital buys cheaply against a working class too embittered to accept the sacrifices open rivalry between blocs will demand. Rationed resources, redirected industry, sons and daughters called to war in the name of the nation. We have documented this function twice already. In 1914, Europe's mass workers' parties answered imperialist war not with class struggle, but with the Union Sacrée. War credits, national unity. They repeated the same betrayal between 1939 and 45, subordinating the workers' movement to coalitional governments in the national war effort. Reformism never transcended wage labor, and its failure opened not the road to revolution, but to reaction, which inherited both the paternal state reformism and that they had built and a working class already disciplined for national sacrifice. So let me say plainly where we stand. We have no reason to defend the capitalist left against this accusation of communism, an accusation that degrades the name far more than the accused have ever threatened bourgeois society. The state now denounces rent control and municipal reform with the same vocabulary once reserved for those who opposed imperialist war for the great proletarian struggle of the past, not because these movements menace the wage relation, but because a bourgeois driven by accumulation and recurring crises of overproduction is compelled to sharpen the antagonism between its own factions. As capital centralizes, the interests of the great bourgeois collide with those of the declining petty bourgeois, each trying to shift the burden of crisis into the other. This contradiction has never stood outside capitalism. It has furnished bourgeois politics with its very dynamism, the endless alteration of parties and programs, leaving the foundation of wage labor, commodity production, and the state completely untouched. No conspiracy is required. It is enough that the ruling class, through the ordinary functioning of its own political organs, reproduce the ancient comedy of democracy against oligarchy, by which the American proletarian has for generations been enlisted behind rival bourgeois camps, each promising to save society from the other while jointly preserving the dictatorship of capital. Our position is one of complete intransigence. We defend neither the democratic faction falsely denounced as communist nor the repressive apparatus that imagines itself defending civilization from subversion, nor the desperate adventurism that mistakes provocation for revolution. Against every faction, we affirm the same invariant program, the abolition of wage labor, the enterprise, and of commodity production, and of the state that guarantees them, whatever colors it flies, whatever language it speaks, whatever personnel administrate it.
Machines that are no match for the organic party. Comrades, I want to start with the question of the Philistine. The Philistine always asks us. Look at the numbers, he says. How on earth will our tiny party ever hope to match up to these relative Goliaths of opportunism? And the answer is by avoiding the sordid activist rat race to begin with. We can say with absolute certainty that it is our only current which remains not only authentically communist, but genuinely anti-capitalist. It is therefore only our party which truly represents the interest and historical aims of the proletarian class in today's society. No matter how small we may be, where does the proletariat appear as a class? Only here, in the party. Outside it, he is merely an individual worker scattered in the wind. So understand, there is no compensation to be found. The Marxist doctrine of social crisis guarantees the restoration of the mass proletarian movement, and on these historical grounds, not on passing fashions of bourgeois politics, that our party has systematically and patiently carried out its work of revolutionary preparation. Within the all-consuming bourgeois world, countless impostors have come and gone. each demonstrating an immature and spurious understanding of the revolutionary social science of Marxism. When the next social crisis compels the working masses into struggle, these pragmatic fictions will be brushed aside by the proletariat with no greater effort than it takes to flick an ant from one's skin. Behind the aesthetics, behind the game of appearances these Stalinist parties play, lies not a proletarian program, but the program of a radicalizing petite bourgeois middle class. Let me show you what I mean with the actual landscape in front of us. The Party for Socialism and Liberation ran a national ticket in 2024 that outperformed every prior self proclaimed socialist presidential campaign in decades. Communist Party of USA's membership rolls are climbing for the first time in a generation. A brand new American Communist Party is finding its audience before it has even finished writing its own founding documents. Each presents itself as a harder edged alternative to the Democratic Socialists of America. Yet each alleged break on inspection turns out to be almost entirely rhetorical. What we are looking at is not a movement of the proletariat, is the continual downward spiral of the American middle class, the disillusionment reaching for answers the existing political establishment cannot give, and yet still unwilling to give its childish attachment to the fairy tale of bourgeois democracy. Deep down, they hope to fix and right the wrongs of the very bourgeois world they desperately want to preserve, so they can keep living their comfortable individual bourgeois lives filled with their personal interests, their hobbies, their shopping habits. Our Che Guevara t-shirt heroes have arrived once more. For the activist intelligentsia, it is out of the fryer and into the pan. Look at what these organizations actually do. The PSL, the CPUSA, co-organize with the liberal DSA sex, endorse the same Democratic candidates, converge on the same liberal demands, progressive taxations, expanded voting rights, budgetary reform on the military, reach through the same petitions, the same performative protests, the same canvases, the same so-called organizing. The ACP leans elsewhere. Less ballot line, more podcasts, promotionalism, and leader worship. Plus, an open nationalism in its own program calls socialist patriotism, what members and critics alike simply call MAGA communism, steeped in petty bourgeois nostalgia for the traditional nuclear family. It is hard to imagine a more repugnant distortion of communism than reading these groups' actual programs. Programs that reek of the most liberal nationalism and reformist drivel. Small wonder that they repel the actual proletarian like noxious bile, despite every attempt to appeal to the masses to meet them where they are, while spewing abject ignorance and stupidity. Each group waves its own large red flag, competing with others to catch the eye of the latest generation of organizational window shoppers and weekend warrior radicals, herding the imagined masses into their respective tiny corrals, bleeding their membership dues for petty bourgeois political ends. DSA's dead end cul-de-sac fenced in by the Democratic Party, or the Booterish Marxism Leninism of the PSL, or the CPUSA, or the ASP alike. Underneath the differing veneers lies the single convergence. Everything these organizations offer, the marches, the branded merchandise, the uninspired activist mantras recited in the streets, is theater performed by imposters who have stolen the costumes of communism and Marxism while repudiating its script. None of these groups is ahead of the organic party. None of them, because what they are growing is not a real party at all, something they have no comprehension of in the first place. History has run this experiment before. These are typical bourgeois party machines built to contain and minister a layer in motion. And machines of that kind are no match over time for the one thing they cannot manufacture: an organic party welded to an invariant program, defended and prepared for the true resurgence of the proletarian masses to social struggle. Our party does not herd the declassed middle classes towards itself to cobble together some regime against the catastrophes capital promises. It is constituted by the very same historical process that produces the crisis in the first place, and it will be there, unchanged, when the machines built to contain that crisis have each in turn been ground up by it. We weathered the counter-revolution, they perpetuated it. All of these groups, in the end, owe their basic orientation to the same unresolved question: what to make of the Soviet Union in its time and China today. Stalinism and its Maoist descendants treat one or both viable socialism. Trotskyism has held the former USSR and China today to be a degenerated worker state worth defending. All of them have abandoned the real communist program, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the abolition of wage labor, of mercantile exchange, of the profit-driven firm as the actual content of communism. No, instead, they worship the state-owned enterprise of the proliferation of reformist pandering. State capitalism dressed up as socialism, a guarantee of a future job for the middle classes and their radicalizing parties. Now let's talk about the dying middle classes' activism and its relationship to Stalinism. The revolution will not be made from more petition signature collecting, mutual aid drives, neighborhood cleanups, phone banks, promotional videos, feel-good protest sign holding, self-important seminars, educational programs, and flag waving, nor from any dose of terrible community building or other survival programs aimed at falsely ameliorating the ills of the bourgeois world while standing waist deep in its social swamp. No amount of personal self-sacrifice and heroics can overcome hard-coded material conditions that keep the masses inert. What they want is social connection. What they want to end alienation without destroying what alienates them: capital. Utopianism in a nutshell. Activism and Stalinism are two complementary expressions of the same bourgeois deviation: the substitution of imperialism and pragmatism for dialectical materialism in the invariant communist program. Both conceive the party not as the organic historical expression of the proletariat's determined course toward communism, but as an apparatus to be consciously constructed, expanded, and managed through activism, recruitment, tactical innovation, and organizational technique. This is the outlook of the middle class itself, whose social position is defined by instability, by competition, by the constant need to defend its status through individual initiative, social networking, and continual innovation in method. For them, communism is state-run enterprise, higher order democracy, and the miserable full employment of society. As the middle classes are increasingly proletarianized, their insecurity and alienation express themselves as an endless search for practical inventions that promise to ameliorate social dislocation without abolishing its material basis. Pragmatism and imperialism, then, are not merely philosophical errors. They are the characteristic outlook of strata whose very existence depends on adapting to changing conditions, who judge truth by what appears to work in the present moment. Dialectical materialism, by contrast, is the theoretical expression of the proletariat as a historical class, and its worldview and its reality. It evaluates politics not by immediate utility or organizational success, but by the objective development of the capitalist mode of production and the historical movement of the class struggle. The communist program is not a tactical instrument to be revised according to circumstance. It is the historical continuity of the proletariat struggle arising from the material contradictions of capitalism itself. For the opportunist, the question ceases to be whether the party expresses the historical interests of the proletariat and becomes instead whether the party apparatus can be expanded, strengthened, rendered for more effective within the bourgeois society itself, in defense of present conditions as a way of proving the functional, practical value of the party machine of winning more adherents, more dependence. In this framework, activism appears less as the political expression of a deceived proletariat than as a moral and psychological compensation of a declining middle stratum clinging to its own social existence. While Stalinism elevates that same pragmatism into a doctrine of party building, statecraft, and national development, subordinating communist principle to immediate success of and reformist demand. As Bernstein put it, the movement is everything. The final goal is nothing. Against this, we insist the Revolutionary Party cannot be fabricated through voluntarist activism or organizational engineering. It emerges organically from the historical movement of the class itself, a trajectory determined by the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, not by the empirical calculations of self-appointed genius militants perpetually evaluating the situation, forever trying to seize the moment through heroics at the opportune time. Why did this outlook become dominant? Let's look at the history. The post-war expansion of capitalism created the broadest, most materially secure middle strata in modern history. The destruction of productive capacity in the Second World War inaugurated the exceptional period of accumulation that enormously expanded the managerial, professional, academic, technical, and administrative layers of society. These strata required political reforms suited for their own interests. Reformism rather than revolution, democratic administration rather than the class dictatorship, activism rather than pragmatic continuity. The New Deal in America, social democracy in Europe, and their developmental Stalinist counterpart in the East. All of it worked to stabilize capitalism and its middle classes, setting them up for later liquidation under the law of capital accumulation. All it took to secure that temporary existence was a couple of world wars, and the very same suicidal live for today mentality is still spewed everywhere by the middle classes today amid their rampant denial of the massive preparation across all of society for the next great imperialist war. In the past, the growing numerical and ideological weight of this stratum drew substantial sections of the proletariat into organizations and movements whose politics reflected not the independent historical interest of labor, but the mediating role of an expanding petty bourgeois and labor aristocracy under imperialism. The mass parties of social democracy, the bureaucratic apparatuses of Stalinism, and later the proliferation of activist organizations, all of it corresponded to this historical specific phase of capitalist development, just as it is unfolding again today on a similar razor's edge. Today, the material foundation is steadily disappearing. Monopoly capitalism progressively eliminates the relative autonomy of the middle strata through the conservation and centralization of capital, reducing them toward general conditioned wage labor while simultaneously stripping them of the privileges that once distinguished them. The political radicalization is therefore the expression of an incoherent class stratum struggling for its own survival. not the emergence of a proletarian politics. Their activism seeks not the abolition of capitalist social relations, but the mitigation of their own insecurity, their own alienation, their own downward mobility. As this leveling continues, these intermediary strata lose not only their economic independence, but their political independence too. Their organizations find themselves absorbed into, subordinated by, and destroyed within the dominant parties of capital. In the United States, this shows up as the continual gravitational pull the Democratic Party exerts over every activist and reformist current. Some keep struggling within it, hoping to democratize or transform it from the inside. Others advocate a dirty break, imagining that organizational separation alone can preserve the same activist politics under a different institutional roof. Both, in the end, remain products of the same declining class, a class that will bind itself either to the party of the bourgeois or to the only true party of the proletarian, the International Communist Party. Let me turn now to the deeper theoretical question, the relationship between party and class, determinism, and what I call the biological brain. The relationship between party and class is not one of representation or delegation. It is organic, a single historical body in which the class supplies the material force and the terrain of struggle, while the party, as its most conscious and continuous organ, supplies the direction that force could never generate on its own. Our tradition calls this the reversal of praxis. The collective, doctrinally continuous action of the party outweighs the sum of its individual militants, precisely because consciousness here runs from the organized whole back down into the parts rather than upward from isolated individual wills. This is why the party's conception of itself is organic rather than voluntarinist, rather than merely organizational. It rests on the biological and material reality of the human species itself, on the fact that cognition is a determined process. The brain, programmed by a mind that retains only what present conditions require, cannot on its own preserve what present conditions have not yet demanded. A body of doctrine capable of outlasting and outreasoning any single nervous system has to be logged in a collective organ built to survive where individual consciousness cannot. The indispensable task of the party is to preserve the invariant doctrine, to provide the political leadership through which the scattered struggles of the class are unified into a single historical direction, a plan of action the masses could never spontaneously arrive at their own. For this reason, the party is often small, not by choice, but by the historical necessity. Its size rises and falls with the development of objective contradictions. At one moment, reduced to a handful of disciplined militants, at another, becoming the decisive political force in the crisis. It neither isolates itself from proletariat nor dissolves itself into it. It meets workers in the concrete struggles imposed by bourgeois society, fighting alongside them when it has the forces to do so, while bringing to those struggles the full historical continuity of Marxist doctrine. This is what our tradition calls the reversal of praxis, because the party's action is collective, unilaterally connected through the party alone to the whole accumulated historical experience of the class. It can be conscious and coordinated toward a goal in a way no individual no a collective mass organization ever could. The party expresses in our words, or in the words our tradition uses of itself, a power of 100 times greater than numerical strength, precisely because that strength was never where the numbers were being counted. This claim rests on materialism with deep roots. Let me take you through the history briefly. Already in antiquity, Democritus held that nothing occurs at random, that everything happens for a reason and by necessity, grounding early autonomism in a strict causal order of nature. Spinoza radicalized this in Ethics, arguing that in nature there is nothing contingent, that all things are determined by the necessity of the divine nature to exist and act in a certain way. In classical mechanics, Laplace gave determinism its most famous formation, an intelligence that knew the position of every particle and every force acting upon it at a given instant. That uh, could calculate the entire course of the universe. For such an intelligence, nothing would be uncertain. The future would lie before it just as plainly as the past. These were bourgeois scientists working within and for a rising bourgeois order, still capable of confronting nature honestly, before the same class had need of obstructionism to defend its rule. Matter is not inert uh, substratum waiting for an external force to set in motion. Motion is the mode of existence of matter itself. Society is no exception. Capitalism is not an eternal or natural order. Capitalism is not a eternal or natural order requiring some outside intervention to topple it. It is a historical determined mode of production generated by determinate conditions and therefore capable of being superseded through the unfolding of those very same conditions. The formal party itself is no less determined than any other social institution by the conditions of bourgeois society within which it operates. It can, it cannot will revolutionary circumstances into existence through sheer voluntarism. What distinguishes the party is not freedom from historical determination. It is the possession of the communist doctrine. It is the phrase of our own tradition, the reservoir of the attitudes and positions that the communist social person of the future will adopt. And here, the party's own materialist theory of mind tells us exactly what the position concretely means. The brain is not a passive registry. It is programmed by the mind to process moment by moment only the notions required to solve problems that moment by moment ensure the survival of the individual. Where the brain lacks a notion it needs, the organism sets out to acquire it through material activity. This is exactly the condition of middle class, the condition of middle class man under stable bourgeois rule. His brain is furnished by an ideological knowledge that molds him from the cradle with precisely the autonomism sufficient for his role. The ready-made objectivity that presents the existing economic political order as given by nature as only one possible and nothing more, because present conditions demand nothing more of him. Revolutionary notions find no purchase there. They are not repressed so much as biologically unnecessary, absent from a mind whose programming answers only to conditions as they now stand. The party exists to hold, to transmit, to keep and act intact exactly the notions that present conditions do not yet demand. The one still functioning bourgeois order gives the proletarian brain no occasion to acquire. It does not wait on spontaneous demand to manufacture its supply. Long term memory itself, on the party's own account, persists this way, retaining ideas whose immediate utility is absent, but whose future necessity is assured. The party's militants bear the cost of articulating what the present moment cannot yet absorb. so that when the crisis finally forces new problems onto the masses whose old programming has failed them, the doctrine is not invented on the spot. It is recalled, already preserved, already transmitted, already there in the biological handwriting of the brain's subconscious, in the muscle memory of the vanguard element of the proletariat within whom the party has made contact. Comrades, this is why the numbers of the Philistine points to mean nothing. The machines will be ground up by the very crisis they were built to contain. We will still be here. Thank you.